So let's absolutely dive into some of that background because I have a lot to tell you. Again, just because they're a tragic story does not mean they're unimpugnable at all. This is a story. The Manic Street Preachers story is a story about a band from a far flung corner of the country, a band both anachronistic and futuristic at the same time. It's about a working class, politically minded alternative to the rise of Britpop, good times, and lad culture. It is also a story about mental illness and self harm and eating disorders. So, fair warning for any listeners who may be rather freaked out by that. This is definitely going to get a bit dark. And of course, if you're struggling with any of these problems, know that asking for help is a sign of strength. I hope everyone knows that. But okay, all that said, we're going to do our best to keep it as light and airy as possible, given some of this subject matter, because I assume that's why you tuned in, is for the hilarity. So, the Manic Street Preachers, or the Manics, as they're known, are from a small part of South Wales called the Valley, specifically a town called Blackwood. It's a little outside of Cardiff. And we're talking post-industrial town in complete decay. Factories closed, mines been shut down, there's no money coming in, community struggling, kind of thing. And I don't know if we have touched upon it. I don't know why we would touch upon the miners' strike of 84, 85. But it's arguably one of the most important political moments in recent UK history. And it definitely has a place in this story. But it was basically like the last gasp of the mining unions to stand up to increased offshoring and mechanization and mine closures as the resources of England and the UK in general became more and more expensive to produce. And long story short is Margaret Thatcher won that battle, and a lot of these mining towns went into ruin shortly thereafter. So that's kind of like the setting for this, the beginning of this band where these guys grew up. We're talking about the 80s in Wales. So first, let's just talk about the band members themselves. We've already alluded to some of these characters. There's 4 people in this band. One guy is called James Dean Bradfield. He's the lead vocalist and the lead guitar player. There's a guy called Richie Edwards, also sometimes credited as Richie James. I'll probably just shorten his name down to Richie consistently. He's a rhythm guitar player. I'm going to use that term very loosely because he actually does not play a note of music on this entire record, but he wrote, let's say, something like 75% of the lyrics and was considered the de facto leader of the band. He also helped with things like the design and the production for the band. There's a guy called Sean Moore, who's the drummer, and a guy called Nicky Wire, who plays bass guitar. That is a stage name because he's really tall and skinny. So let's talk about where these guys came from, right? James Bradfield and Sean Moore, the drummer, are actually cousins. So not only are they from this small town, but they actually lived together from the age of 10 because of a divorce in one of their families. And the rest of the gang all knew each other from primary school on. They originally formed a band in 1986 when they're all about 17, 18. This would be in high school in Blackwood in Wales together. And the original name of the band was called Betty Blue. This was a 4-piece with a 4th guy who was not Richie. It was a guy called Miles Woodard, whose stage name was Flicker. He actually was originally playing bass in this original incarnation of the band, but within a relatively short amount of time, by 1988, this guy Flicker leaves the band because he doesn't like how far away from hardcore punk music they're going. So, like all great musical stories, Nicky Wire decides, now they are in need of a bass player, and Nicky Wire goes, "Well, I'll just switch from guitar to bass."
They're basically the same thing, right?
Basically the same thing,
Yeah,
except
you don't need any
one's
specialized
easier.
skill to play the bass.
So he switches over, and they're a 3-piece for a while. And the way their songwriting works, even back then, is that this guy Nicky writes the lyrics, and then James and Sean, that's the guitar player and the drummer, finish the songs from there. So it's actually interesting. I didn't really get the sense that they wrote simultaneously. I more got the sense that they wrote in an assembly line, which I agree doesn't make sense when you listen to the recording, where it does seem like the melodies are trying to fit in the words. But
I think that for this album particularly, especially with what Richie Edwards was going through, I get the sense that he was a lot more removed, right, from the rest of the band members, and was maybe kind of doing this stuff like in his room alone and delivering them.
yeah,
So yeah.
I'm just saying I got this. I never heard that they literally wrote them in parallel and smashed them together, meaning words written in one place and melody and music written in another place and then kind of pushed together. Instead, it seemed like it was always being described as lyrics first, hand off the notebook, and then we'll go ahead and write the song. But I agree, if you listen to what we get on the record, it doesn't sound like that. So at this time, this guy Richie is a friend and a roadie for these guys. He's been their buddy since elementary school. He drives them around between shows. He helps them with some of their early design work, some of their press releases. He has, by his own admission, zero musical talent, but they opt to make him a full-time member anyway, as a rhythm guitarist, even though he literally would fake play a guitar that was not turned on stage.
Yeah,
at least in the early days.
There's a video of them playing the Reading Festival, and he's like just miming. You can tell he's just miming his guitar up there at Reading, and he's not even playing. I mean, he's playing, but he's obviously his amp's not plugged in.
So it's a little bit of a weird situation, but they obviously felt he had other aspects to contribute. His big contribution, like we said, is writing, right? So he starts getting in there and writing lyrics, collaborating a bit with this other guy, Nicky, who was also writing lyrics, helping them get more and more political. It's the reason I gave you the background of their kind of they have this working class chip on their shoulder. They're from a town where there's very few jobs, very little opportunity. People are poor, and they're mad about it. You know?
Oh, are they really? Are they upset? I cannot tell.
So this guy Richie, he's a little bit of a Sid Barrett type in all the good and bad ways, I think. But he's kind of this personality who's hard to take your eyes off of. He's like, they talk about when they get on stage with him, just somehow, some way, he just becomes the focal point. He's the best looking guy. He's the coolest dressed guy. He just is the one that people want to stare at for whatever reason, right?
Rob, we fucked up by getting good at our instruments. We should have just focused on our outfits.
That would have helped. That guy.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Hit
it's
the
true.
gym more, go to the fucking thrift store, get some cool outfits. We could have made it happen, man.
I don't love this part of the story, but I have to say that if you choose to interpret it as they were such great friends, they wanted to help this guy along, I think that part resonates with us a little bit, right? Like, I'd rather be in a band with my friends than some stranger who happens to be really great at their instrument, and we've all, well, at least two of us have been through that exact experience.
We had John on bass. That's why I played the drums for a period of time.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
So, okay, come around to 1990, they get signed by a record label called Damaged Goods to a 1 EP deal. The EP is called New Art Riot, and it's done in part because of the braggadocious press kit written by Richie. Like, he would just write bragging, arrogant things about how great a band they were, the best band in the world. I'm sure partially being tongue-in-cheek, and just send it out to people. Like, he was good at promoting this band, right?
Rob, I'm beginning to understand more why you really like this band, because that's exactly what you did back when we were in the shop. We're like, they're the greatest band ever. We actually can barely play our instruments, but, listen.
Fuck it, fake it till you make it is a good strategy, dear audience, right? So on the strength of that EP, they get signed to a slightly bigger indie called Heavenly Records. This one is based in London. They record some singles, and they're starting to get some heat, right? But before that even comes around, they're starting to get a rep in the UK music press as being these very political, very intense post-punk guys. And here I'm going to reference one of our favorite bands that we get written to about the most, which is Gang of Four. They definitely love Gang of Four. They're kind of in that mold of a band, let's say. So
listen, Gang of Four appears a ton in my notes for this album, specifically in a non-complimentary way to this album, because as much as I shit on Gang of Four when we did it, I have come to really like that album and listen to it kind of frequently. And they have a lot to say as well, but they say it in a way that you can understand, and it gives it so much more weight when there is a meter to what you're saying. I don't care about the melody. The melodically delivered in a flat way like they do on Gang of Four is fine, as long as it sticks to some kind of meter and you can sort of understand what's going on. Again, I'm not trying to get back into talking shit on this album, but that muddled the message for me a lot on this.
Yeah, I hear you. And I have to say, I mostly listened to this album this week without thinking too hard about the lyrics. And I know we talk a lot on this podcast. We go back and forth. Different people say, oh, I'm a lyrics guy. I'm not a lyrics guy, such and such. But the reality is, I think you can and should switch your mindset at different times to different things, depending on what's going on in the music and what the music is sort of telling you to focus on. So I do still think it's a fair criticism, Tom. I'm just saying that I think the music can be enjoyed without diving too deep into the lyrics as well. But okay, I wanted to mention that as they are this very intense, kind of overly serious, maybe political band, there is this one journalist from NME called Steve Lamarck
Oh yeah.
who isn't buying it. He's not buying the hype. He's been sort of combative with them in his articles. He's throwing them shade while he's reviewing other bands, which feels like bad form, but also it's like something we would do.
Yeah.
Maybe he could come on our show. And so there's this story. He goes to a show one night around this time, and he talks to Richie, who, like I said, he's the de facto leader after the show. And basically, he's being adversarial and he's questioning about the band's commitment to the political causes that they write songs about, that they espouse, and questioning their commitment to those causes. And during this backstage interview, Richie pulls out a razor blade and starts cutting into his own forearm the words "for real," the number 4, and the word "real." Apparently, while continuing to talk to this guy that he doesn't really like that much. And the journalist doesn't really know what to do. So he just keeps asking questions and conducting this interview as normal. And this brings us to a dark as hell version of our favorite segment here, by the numbers. The first number I want to tell you about is 17. That's the number of stitches Richie needed after this grotesque affair. And look, at the time, Richie had been getting into self-harm. Bandmates said he'd been stubbing cigarettes out on his arms and stuff like that. And sadly, I don't think his bandmates or anyone around him really understood the implications of this behavior, or at least not fully. The cutting into his arm after that show was kind of seen as this like brazen rock and roll press stunt that was, and it was basically reported and photographed that way.
It's like it's like Ozzy biting the head off a bird, or so something like that.
Something like that. And by the way, there is a picture of this. I do not recommend Googling it. I'm kind of sorry.
Yeah,
I looked
horrible.
at it. It's really grotesque. And of course, he went straight to the hospital after this. I mean, this is talking about a lot of blood here.
Pussy.
But it was. So next number I want to throw out there is 250,000. That's in pounds. The contract they signed with Columbia Records within a week of this attention-getting incident. I can't say for certain that these events are related, but it gives you a bit of a sense of how these behaviors are kind of easily written off as rock and roll excess and showmanship at the time, and not really maybe given the weight that maybe they should be given. So
I do think that the British tabloid press certainly played a part in their rise to popularity, right? And we kind of talked about that in the Oasis episode recently, where they released a single and got a little bit of fame and then started being crazy assholes. And the tabloids were like, these guys are easy to write about because they're sensational. And that spiked their popularity, got a lot more eyes on them and a lot more ears on their albums. And I'm not trying to entirely shit on that because so much of rock and roll is self-promotion, but I did get a sense in my research that you talked about not being able to separate the situations around the band from the music. I don't really like that a whole lot. I like the music to kind of stand on its own. And some of this seemed like it was overly hyped because of some of their eccentricities. And then they leaned into those eccentricities lyrics wise, because clearly that's what's getting you attention, right?
Yeah, it could be. I think another way to process that might be, I mean, I do think it's a fair criticism. That's certainly possibly what's going on here. To my eye, listening to interviews with these guys, listening to the lyrics, reading their story, they come off to me as very earnest. And maybe it's because of what happened to them. It's possible. But I guess another way to recast that story about the press is that that's all fun and games, but that's also how people get chewed up in the system, unfortunately, right? And it's obviously it's hard to predict when you're a journalist writing about something what effect your words are going to have, but you should think a little bit about it.
Well, in the early 90s, there was such a, like, those two things, journalism and music, were kind of always hand in hand. There's always some sort of public events that would happen related to lots of musicians. You talked about Guns N' Roses earlier, with Axl Rose like pissing in an airport floor, or
Sure.
all kinds of stuff were going on. So I think that wasn't super uncommon for bands to get caught up in these publicity type events.
Sure. Or even you throw it to a little later, like Britney Spears getting chewed up by the music machine and then very publicly having a breakdown and that being
Oh,
a
right.
huge story that everyone's like, oh, we can make a ton of money following her around and watching her go crazy. It's, it's a little exploitative, certainly.
Yeah, for sure. So on that Columbia Records contract, they record their debut record called Generation Terrorists and are very vocal in the press about how it's going to sell 30 million copies and how they're going to sell out Wembley Stadium and set themselves on fire live on top of the Pops. And the context for these brags is our next number, which is 40, the average number of people they were playing to at the time while they're making these brags. We're talking empty clubs, but they had big dreams. And like you said, the press was definitely eating it up. The bravado and fake it till you make it attitude is a big part of what resonates with me, let's say. Not so much the rock and roll excess aspect, but that was something they had in common with, I think, the times. They were coming of age in this Britpop era, kind of at the tail end of the hair metal era. We've already referenced Guns N' Roses. So next number I want to throw out to you, 10 million. That is the estimated number of records sold by Manic Street Preachers worldwide, which is a lot, given that I basically never heard of them until last week.
Mm-hmm.
So perhaps it's indicative of just how big this musical world can be. Perhaps it's indicative, as some of our hate mailers like to tell us, that we know nothing about music and how dare we. But clearly they've made some kind of impact on the artistic world. And
it was uneven, their record sales. They were never big in the US, right?
That is correct.
No. Yeah, they're definitely, Europe, UK band. But I just wanted to cut in real quick just for you guys, especially Marty and Tom, who probably don't know. I think like this record is an outlier for them as far as the band. Their later records, you guys would probably really like them because it's still it's like good hard rock, played good, and that whole thing with the lyrics and everything that turned you off, Tom. That's not really going on anymore, and they just sort of turned into this good band. But this album is really an outlier for them.
Yeah, fair enough. And I will say I was intrigued enough by them that if another of their albums comes across my plate, I will not be like, nope, no chance. I will definitely listen to it again. Like I thought the album was okay. I part of me is just sort of admitting that I don't get it.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And it took me some time to get as well. So I'm going to try to bring some of that context to close out our By the Numbers segment. The last number I want to tell you about is more than I'd care to admit, as in the number of hours I spent researching, listening, and generally trying to get this record
nice
on a deep level in prep for our show tonight. Listen, we always try our damnedest to get the full story, but this week I felt an instant hard to describe kinship with the record, I'll be honest, even though it was my first time listening, and I really wanted to spend the time understanding it. And I recognized instantly that this is one of the downsides of how we do things, that it's not a lot of time to really get comfortable with something. So just letting you know that I wanted to spend that time understanding it and understanding the band and what happened to them so that I could bring it to you, dear listeners. So thank you for being here, for streaming this, for caring enough to come every week and support what we're doing here, because it's definitely a labor of love. And we're trying hard to bring you well-researched behind-the-scenes stories every week with a heaping dose of hilarity, which is perhaps most important, as I mentioned, when the subject matter turns dark. So thank you. You can support us, of course, by sharing this podcast with a friend or an appropriate fan group online, or leaving us a 5-star review. Or if you care to hear even more of our sonorous voices, hop over to Patreon. It's linked in the episode notes to hear our brand new bonus show called Song Battle, where we use a bracket system to argue over and eventually crown the best song of the 1990s. It's only $5 a month. It's a beer per month. You get some cool extra stuff if you're inclined. But regardless, we're going to keep bringing you this totally free weekly deep dive on records. Okay, back to the story of the Manic Street Preachers. So these guys are overtly political, as we mentioned. They're leftist in the style of their heroes like The Clash. And they're very working class. And there's this, at the time, as now, there's the growing strain of nationalism on the rise in the UK, especially via a political party called the BNP, the British National Party, which I only brought that up because, of course, Morrissey was supporting this political group even back then and draping himself in the British flag and saying Britain for the British. And anyway, this led to a little minor flame war where Ritchie called the Smiths in the UK press the biggest disaster which probably happened to the UK. This is just the saddest day in our lives, that this is the future of rock and roll.
All right,
So,
I like this album a lot more now. Let's go.
Yeah, right.
the point, though, is that in their mind, and I do think this is sincere, that there is a clear and present danger that Britain and Western society in general is moving backwards, and it's fuel for their writing and for some of their shows. So, okay, let's flash forward a bit to try to get up to where the record is. So their careers is on the come up. Their first record comes out in 92. They sell 250,000 copies of that record. Like we said, it's mostly a UK phenomenon, but they tour through Europe and the UK. They gain fans. They're UK press darlings through this time. They make a follow-up with more money called Gold Against the Soul. That's released in 1993. It's recorded in some old manor house with lots of bells and whistles. And it has disappointing sales, although it actually makes it to 8 on the UK charts. So it charts better, sells worse. The band sort of hates it from the jump, citing
Not as good a record. Yeah. Not a good record.
They felt like the corporate influence of the label and the corporate money, they kind of lost sight of themselves during that period and got a little unfocused with some of the rock and roll decadence that with money being thrown at them to make the record, right? They're still a working band that does not have a lot of money, though. I can't stress that enough. That continues for a little while yet. So
you're telling me they sold 250,000 copies of their album. They don't have any money. And this is in the late 80s, where even if they got $1 a record, it's not bad. And they're touring. That seems like poor money management.
It might be poor. It's possible. It's possible it's poor money management, but their next 2 records do not sell so well. So I think that is part of the problem. It could be that they spent too much money on making that second record too, which the label likes to give you a free credit card, but then you pay it all back, right? Point is, they're trying to get back to their roots. And Ritchie in particular starts writing a bunch of new stuff at this time. Some of it's influenced by a band field trip to Dachau, the concentration camp. Hard to believe, right?
Oh, yes, that's hence the cheery attitude of this.
Yeah, I just want to interject real quick. If you're wondering how depressing this album is, it doesn't have one, but it has 2 songs about the Holocaust.
Yeah.
Gosh.
Yeah, it's kind of rough, and he's also doing lots of reading on historical fascism and all of the terrible parts of human nature. He's quoted around this time as saying, "Evil is an essential part of the human condition, and the only way to get over it is to recognize it's in all of us."
And this guy was depressed reading about like all the horrible things humans have done to each other. I know that the 2 aren't necessarily connected, but probably doesn't help a whole lot.
Gives you a sense of the mindset. So they have this bleaker set of lyrics, and to match the bleaker tone of the lyrics and remove themselves from the corporate money fountain a bit more, when Columbia, and actually the imprint they're on Columbia is called Epic Records. When Epic Records, which is a subsidiary of Columbia, ask where they want to record their next record, they say, let's do it on the cheap. Let's do it in Cardiff at a very small studio. In fact, I think Epic Records wanted them to go to Barbados or something like that. Like, go ahead, rack up the bill, see what happens. But they're like, no, let's stay in town. They go to this place called Sound Space. It's run down. It's in the red light district of Cardiff. The Manics, they call themselves, this is a little pretentious, they call themselves method musicians. Like they're trying to live and breathe what they're talking about. I can understand where they're coming from. But basically, they were really stoked about this location. They thought it would help bring back their focus, bring them back into their playing, the opposite of, like I said, rock star decadence. Okay, so we talked about how Nicky Wire and Ritchie would typically work together, but apparently during this period, Ritchie kind of took over. He's credited with, they can't quite decide, but something like 75 or 80% of the lyrics on this record. And part of the reason for that is that Nicky Wire, I guess, was happily married at the time and wasn't depressed at all. He was in a good spot. Whereas Ritchie was feeling inspired by the doldrums of life and all this reading he's doing, visiting concentration camps and all the other encroaching chaos of the world, right?
Yeah, I can see the happily married Nikki Wire coming back and being like, I've been thinking that our taxes are too high. Maybe we should cut some of those social programs now that I'm a homeowner and I guess, I got a wife and kids to support.
It all starts to change. By the way,
Yeah.
speaking of his name, Wire, I watched some live performances. I think he's only 6'3", but he towers over the other members of this band. It's
Well,
kind of scary.
interesting.
He's like significantly above average height, and I think they must all be at least slightly below average height. But okay, he looks like he's on stilts or something. Okay.
Yeah, they're just a bunch of malnourished Welsh miners or something like that.
Yeah,
So by the end of '93, they've written the songs to mostly Richie's lyrics. They head into the studio in January of 1994, and a little more context for the mood here, as if we weren't already in enough of a bummer, is James, the lead singer's fiance, dumps him, and their longtime manager dies of cancer right at that time. So there's really a cloud over them, in particular the death of their manager, who was a close friend of theirs. They credited him with a lot of their success up to that point. And, I give this context not only because of what's on the tape, but because of what happens to Richie, mainly in the next 12 months or so. So, as we alluded to during the sessions, Richie doesn't really do too much, doesn't have much to do. He doesn't do anything musically, in fact. And like I said, I think he's actually playing real guitar on stage at this point, at least some of the time. But he doesn't play a note on this record. So his part's kind of done. But he hangs out at the studio every day anyway, drinking, crying, sleeping in the control room all day, every day. That's what they said. And it's so really very Syd Barrett-esque, sadly. The band, on the other hand, is like super energized. They like the new songs. For the trio, there's like this renewed sense of purpose. They were really excited to return to what they called a fearlessness about commercial failure, which is coming, I assure you. So they're telling the engineer's just some local guy, cheap guy. They want the music angular. They want it essential. The whole band is taking this very disciplined approach to recording. So again, opposite of Rockstar Decadence. They're showing up promptly every morning at 10. They're working for 12 hours straight. And so they get through it, right? They finish mixing it. Everything's done in May of 1994. They mix it in a different studio over in London. The mixing engineer is a guy called Mark Freegard, who had previously worked with the Breeders. In fact, he gets a co-production credit on Last Splash, along with Kim Deal. And he talked about how his goal was to accentuate the flat, suffocating nature of the record. And again, I think the production on this record is quite good. I kind of feel like the criticism so far has been about maybe the songwriting or how the songwriting and the melody fit together. But to me, the production and the tones on it are excellent.
I would agree. I think it's mixed well too. There's not a lot of muddiness going on, not a lot of stuff running together. And I also agree with the tones. I think that they didn't just stick the knobs in one place since they were done, which is how the whole album's going to sound, which a lot of bands do, and it's not inherently terrible, but this did seem like it was more thought out in terms of production than I was anticipating when I first started listening to it.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay, so they released the first single from this record, Faster, the one we played at the top. They booked some summer festival gigs. They go on Top of the Pops, a very popular television program in the UK. This performance causes a record 25,000 people to call in and complain. I watched it. It's very punk energy. The lead singer, James, is wearing a ski mask, which UK listeners might call a balaclava the entire time. They are all wearing a bunch of random military garb, like cobbled together from military surplus stores around Europe, and there's sort of pillars of actual fire around them. And to be honest, it seems fairly tame by today's standards, but definitely exciting in rock and roll. I guess the ski mask was an unintentional symbol of the IRA, or either the band said it was not intentional. So some folks were pretty freaked out by that, but it's got energy, and I have to say, like, watching these guys live they seem very exciting. I think the songs pop in particular there.
Sure. And, I could see them actually being supporters of like a Welsh independence movement or something like that. That would probably be philosophically in line with what they do.
I did not get any hint of that, actually, that they don't seem that engaged with Welsh nationalism. Perhaps it's because it's been beaten down so much, because I don't think any of them speak Welsh. I could be wrong. Listeners, correct me. And we covered another Welsh band on the podcast many moons ago called Super Furry Animals. And they were also, they were friends with this band, at least to an extent, and part of this movement called the Cool Cymru movement, which is the Welsh term for Wales, where there was a renaissance of Welsh music happening around Cardiff at the time. Super Furry Animals were a part of that. Manic Street Preachers were a part of it. So, but I think in both cases, I remember we alluded to something like the Super Furry Animals might be pro-Welsh nationalism, and some listener wrote in as like, no, they don't care at all about that.
Yeah. I will be honest. Literally the first time that I put the album on, I was like 30 seconds in, and I was like, "Are they speaking Welsh? Is this what Welsh sounds like? I can't understand a fucking word this guy is saying." And then it got to a point in the song where it's like, "Oh no, I definitely recognize like 4 or 5 words I know in a row there." So that okay.
You mean after like the sample that begins every song that goes on for the first 40 seconds.
After the weird sample, yes.
Okay, we're almost to the end of our story here, and then we are going to talk about the songs, but let's finish it out. So they start playing some shows before the album comes out. First time they're playing the songs. There's a story about how, I just thought this was interesting, they're really big in Thailand. For some reason, some Thai DJ was like playing the hell out of them. And so they have all these fans, and they go to Thailand. That's the first place they play these songs. And there are these young fans there who have the "for real" thing like written in Sharpie on their arm, like that's a badge of honor. And some young kid fan presents Richie with a set of ceremonial knives and asks if he will use them to cut himself that night on stage. And
Jesus,
he does do that. So shit is getting dark, right? So back to the UK. It's July of '94. Their single's out. Richie's drinking and self-harm has become life-threatening, and he gets committed to a hospital for treatment. I couldn't get much detail here as to exactly what happened here. Could have been an actual suicide attempt. May have just been him losing a bunch of weight, because it seems like he was also struggling with anorexia at this time. And as an added context, the song on this record entitled 4ST7LB is a reference to 4 stone 7 pounds, also known as 69 pounds, which is the weight below which death is said to be medically unavoidable for an anorexic.
Interesting.
So he's struggling with a lot of stuff. The band, for their part, decides to keep their summer gigs as a trio, in part to promote the upcoming album that isn't quite out yet, and in part to have money to pay for this private hospital that Richie's at, because obviously they really want him to get better. So here we are finally at the release of this record, right? The Holy Bible, a not at all arrogant name for your album.
Yeah.
So this is August 30th, 1994. It comes out to a mixed critical reaction and doesn't sell that great. NME compared it a lot in their review to In Utero. And I should mention that Kurt Cobain's suicide was on a lot of people's minds that year. That was the same year he committed suicide, in April. And NME says stuff like it's a sneering, hateful, merciless, intelligent, articulate, nasty, raging assault of scattershot sound bites. It's not elegant, but it's effective. I don't quite think it's a bad review, but it's not terribly nice. And they definitely make light of Richie's mental state and things like that. So anyway, the record debuts at number 6, but it sinks quickly after that. And that's probably in part because it happens to come out on the same day as another record we covered recently.
Oh, definitely maybe, right?
Which is Oasis's Definitely Maybe. Same exact day. So just so you know, now this one is certified UK Gold, which is 100,000 copies. It has sold a decent amount, but not as much as their first record, and not a lot by the standards of, I think, what Columbia was expecting for them. But, retrospectively, by the early 2000s, it's considered a classic in the 90s. It's remained very popular in the UK. Melody Maker listed it as the 15th best album of all time on an early 2000s list. NME listed at 44 on a similar list. And Kerrang!, Axl Rose's favorite magazine, placed it at 10th. So, okay, we're going to round out our story here. We're almost to the songs. The album comes out at the end of the summer. Shortly thereafter, Richie is back out and playing with the band. He's on Prozac now. He's working a 12-step AA type program, so it seems like things are looking up. And he's writing a bunch of new stuff. And he is quoted as saying he wants the next record to sound like Nine Inch Nails meets Pantera meets Screamadelica, which is a Screaming Trees album. They play some holiday gigs in London. They end up trashing their instruments at the last gig, which I've just never been a fan of, but apparently it was totally spontaneous for no reason, and it definitely did not make sense financially. That was a $26,000 bill between their equipment and the venue's equipment, and they definitely did not have that money at the time. So, yeah, you're right. They weren't really financially managing themselves very well, I think, overall. Okay, and now to the thrilling conclusion of our story. Come February 1995, James and Richie were set to fly out to America ahead of the band just a little bit to promote the upcoming big album tour with Sponge. Remember those guys?
Oh yeah.
This
One
song
of my favorite karaoke songs.
Is that their one?
Yeah, Plowed. Is
In
it?
a
Yeah,
world
Wow.
of human record.
Yeah,
Totally.
that's my karaoke jam. I
Is
love
that really?
song. Oh yeah, man.
Oh man, I'd never liked that song.
Apparently, the British joke was like they couldn't believe why all these because Sponge to a British person is a cake. So they're just like, why are all these American bands named after food? They thought it was ridiculous.
Right, exactly. Yeah. That's a different band.
Okay, but unfortunately, the day they're meant to fly out, Richie doesn't show up. This is February 1st, 1995. He just disappears. He left all his belongings in his hotel room, although they ultimately found his passport back at his apartment in Cardiff, indicating that he at least stopped back by there. And a couple weeks later, his car is found by a toll bridge somewhere near Cardiff. And he's never been seen again. No body has ever been recovered. So it's remained a little bit of a mystery. Now, couple pieces of information. The band say he was slightly obsessed with the idea of faking his own death and disappearing from the entertainment world. He just something he talked about a lot. But the bridge part seems to indicate a suicide, and of course the tabloids jumped on that instantly. The battery in his car was run down, perhaps indicating he'd been living there for a little bit. But also the steering wheel had a lock on it, like a low jack thing.
The club thing?
The club, yeah.
The club. Yeah.
Right, which maybe indicates that he was going to come back. Anyway, there's no physical evidence that he took his own life, but that is what we can surmise. Over the years, fans have reported seeing him at various foreign places, but no credible sightings. And his family finally decided to rule him legally dead in 2008, so 14 years later. But he was 27 when he disappeared. So 27 club.
I really have to say, a big part of what I was the most excited about for this episode was for you to bust out your cork board with the strings attaching all the different
yeah, right. True Detective.
Yeah.
Right.
Has anyone? I guess it's impossible to know, but has anyone ever pulled off the fake your own death and disappear from the limelight maneuver? Like, has anyone ever come back from that and said like, yeah, that's what I did? Because it would be a cool move.
Eddie did from Eddie and the Cruisers. You remember the end of it? He was standing in front of that the storefront watching the TV, watching the story about his band.
Are you talking about a movie?
Yes. Do you guys not know Eddie and the Cruisers? How much younger are you guys than me?
I think I might have seen that, but I'm talking about a real person.
Oh.
You know, people said this thing about Andy Kaufman. They said obviously about Elvis, Jim Morrison, but it's never happened, right?
Billy the Kid has been famously said to have been wrongfully listed as dead, but there was an old guy later that kept saying he was him.
Hitler.
Let's draw a little bit of a distinction between places where there was a body to be found, and this time, which is a little mysterious, that no body or remains have ever been recovered.
Yeah,
it's not that crazy, but it's definitely a little bit of a mystery in the modern world. So,
isn't that what happened with Jeff Buckley? Didn't he go swimming and his body was never recovered?
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah, he's presumed drowned, I believe. Yeah.
Right.
So maybe it's something to do with water where that can happen, right? But okay, the somewhat happy ending here is that the band, after a while, decided to continue on and make a lot of Richie's new lyrics into new songs, and their follow-up record, Everything Must Go, sold way more records. In fact, it went platinum. That's 1 million sold, and it's actually on Robert Dimery's list as well. So, Tom, it will be coming across your desk eventually.
Yeah, I'm going to have to be washing my hair that day. I'm sorry.
And I should mention, they continue to tour today. In fact, they're playing Edinburgh Castle this summer, where Tom and I used to play when Tom was a drummer. No, I'm joking. They're playing the real Edinburgh Castle. We played a crappy club in San
Francisco. I actually think it's closed, which is
might be. Yeah. I mean, it should. The fire department should have closed it a long time.
Oh yeah, absolutely. That was very not safe.
But no, they're still on tour, and they stayed a trio from there, and they always have a mic set up for their old bandmate. And I believe they still give 25% of everything they make to his estate.
Hmm. That's cool of them.
Okay, I know it's been a long and depressing story, but here we are to dive in and talk about these songs. You guys ready?
Let's do it.